If most of you guys are as big a fan of first-person shooters as I am, then you're probably also excited about the beta test this weekend for Battlefield 2042. Well, I spent most of yesterday playing and, quite frankly, struggling with the game at times, and I'm going to give you some of my experiences and things you can build on so that you have a fun weekend and leave the frustrations at the door. As we look at the recommendations here for both minimum and recommended PC requirements, they did do some updates for this beta test compared to what they put out about a month or so ago. I'm here to tell you if you don't have the minimum requirements of a Ryzen 5 3600 or a 1050 Ti for the graphics card, this may be somewhat of a struggle to run. Now, you can probably run it, but you're not going to be having the settings on low. You may want to also consider turning the resolution down, because even if you have the recommended specs, you're still going to be running a mix of low, medium, and maybe a few high settings mixed in there altogether. A couple things to think about before we get into the game itself is I don't think there were any drivers that were updated for Battlefield 2042 from AMD or from NVIDIA. That's one of those things that should run a little bit smoother when the game actually launches here in a few weeks. As far as your PC itself, make sure you hit the Windows key and type in game mode, and then you go to the Xbox game bar and make sure that is turned off. I do, however, usually leave game mode on as it directs most of the computer's resources towards the game itself. And this is a very resource intensive game. If you're new around here but you enjoy hearing about PC gaming and hardware, please consider hitting the subscription button. If you're just passing through, a like is really appreciated as it always helps me out with the YouTube algorithm. This is no kind of flex on my part, but my primary PC has a 5950X and an RTX 3090 in it, and I quite frankly struggled out of the gate with settings. So if you have less than that in your machine, then keep in mind that some of these higher end settings are really going to be hard to run. I wanted to catch my first game in ultra glory with all the settings turned all the way up, and I figured I had the hardware to be able to handle it. So as you can see here, I had everything maxed out in the graphics settings. Well, how did that go, you ask? Well, as you can see here, the frame drop was sometimes horrendous, and you could really notice it in game. Now, keep in mind, even at ultra with my settings, I'm barely cracking 100 frames per second. So when it drops from high 90s to 50 frames per second, you really notice that kind of drop. Just a quick heads up to save you the hour of frustration that I had yesterday whenever I would die. Call me a savage if you will, but I am somebody that rebinds jump to the caps lock key just because that's what I'm used to from years of gaming. However, in this game, it'll really trip you up whenever you're down and bleeding out. As you can see here, it's telling me caps lock hold to skip to deploy. So I'm mashing that and trying different combinations with my mouse to see if I can get it to work. However, there is no way that I'm going straight to deploy. Instead, I have to bleed out for the entire 30 seconds. What I found out after an hour of frustration is no matter what you bind jump to, it is always going to be the space bar you have to hit to skip to deploy. So being the relatively intelligent gamer I sometimes am, instead of leaving things on ultra with sketchy FPS, I decided I would go ahead and turn everything down to high. Ultra is often overkill, and the frames do obviously suffer most of the time. So I thought maybe high would be the way to go. Surely that will give me enough frame rate to have a smooth encounter on the game. Well, quite frankly, I was wrong. And as you can see here, while we're playing, the weather is really starting to roll in this particular game. And while I'm at 130 FPS, which is obviously more than what I was getting before, what you're going to see here is a massive frame drop all over the place as you start to encounter more rain on screen and you start to get more things going on in the sky at the same time. So there you're seeing it all the way down to 81. So we had lots of stutters and lots of jittering. So after some more fapping about, I decided I was going to go ahead with a mix of custom settings. And after messing around with it for what had to be an hour, this is what worked best for me. But the first thing here in the top half of graphics settings, the chromatic aberration, film grain, vignette, and lens distortion, make sure those are all turned all the way off. Those things will use up a bunch of resources, and it's kind of a mixed bag of what you get out of it during the game. So I tried to mess around having some of them off and on to see what it would result in, and the best thing is just to turn all of them off. As you can see here for the graphics preset, I went with a mix. Now I did keep texture quality on high, and I also kept post-process quality on high because I do want the game to look nice while I'm playing it if it's available and if I can handle it in game. Now I did turn everything else down to medium, and I did make sure I turned ambient occlusion off because that is not really needed in a first-person shooter, at least in my opinion. Now, as you get down here to the very bottom of things, you want to make sure you turn dynamic resolution scale off. That will try very hard to hold on to some FPS. However, you will get a large amount of blur, especially around the edges of your screen. However, on the other hand, you do want to take NVIDIA Reflex Low Latency, and ideally, if your graphics card can handle it, you want to turn that up to Enabled plus Boost. And then I prefer to turn off future frame rendering. It can make the game look really smooth. Again, it will use more resources. And generally speaking, in a shooter, I never have any kind of sync running. I did leave the high fidelity on ultra, and it seemed to be able to handle things pretty well. I'm going to mess around with that a little bit today and see if a lower setting will give me more frames and what it'll actually look like in game. So I eventually got to the point here where settings were ironed out, and although the trade-off was if you look at the underbrush and the foliage and the trees, things like that, they're not as graphically intense or as sharp or just as awesome looking as they were in the beginning. And apparently I'm going to shoot that guy with a rocket because why not? It's Battlefield, right? But what you can see here is we finally got things to the point where it was playable and I could maintain a pretty consistent frame rate, and I wasn't getting lots of stuttering or lots of frame drop or any kind of things where my frame rate was dropping so low. Even with the fire there, I'm still in the 120s, 130s. So that was the mix of settings I ended up with yesterday, finally late in the afternoon, that would give me the most livable combination of both picture and frame rate that I could play the game in and not have a massive amount of frame drop or stuttering while I was in game. As always, guys, a massive thanks for watching the entire video. And until next time, good hunting and GIF out.